As some of you know, this past summer my family went on an extended camping trip and visited all sorts of parks all over the Northeast and New England. And a game popped up. It's amazing what games you'll come up with when you're not tempted by screens 24 hours a day. And our kids found that there was a great game of hide and seek where we would be in a big state park and they would go run off and climb some tree or go out into some field and poke their heads through just enough so that we couldn't see them with our own eyes, but if we took out our fancy cameras and took a picture, our camera would catch it, and then we'd come back later on. It was like, where's Waldo? You know, could you find each other's faces in this picture of vast forest? Can you find the three little faces hiding? And so everywhere we went, they would find a place that would be fitting, whether it was mountains of rocks or deep forests or trees they could climb. I share it tonight because in some ways, it's a great metaphor for what much of the last few years has showed us so intensely, which is that there are so many ways now that we're aware that there are people for whom we want to see, whom we know well, but for whom the world won't let us see them. This week, a friend told me that she lost a dear cousin, someone she had known her whole life. But due to COVID and the environment and travel, that she couldn't attend the funeral that was far away. And in this case, it wasn't being live streamed. And so this person whom she had known her entire life, like a sibling, she couldn't even be there to be at his graveside. We've had this many times over these last few years, as we've come to accept that there are events in our lives that we know under normal circumstances we would say, I wouldn't miss this for the world. But the world says, you're going to have to miss this. So, how do we find a way to feel connected to a person who we may have known our whole life, but who's too far away for us to see? Sometimes, I would blame the very same tool. Sometimes they don't even have to be far away. They can just look like this, in the same house, and you don't even see them. How is it that, even without COVID, something we've struggled with for a long time, how can we stay connected to those, whether they're far away or close to us, who we have a hard time seeing? And we know distance doesn't have that much to do with it, nor does COVID. I met with a former detective of Akron Police this week as well. The same thought struck me. He's working to help law enforcement understand hate crimes, specifically looking at how hate crimes function in different ethnic and religious groups. So he met with me because he knows, as a black man and a former police officer, that he doesn't know what it feels like to be Jewish. We talked for a while, and as he told his stories, it was a reminder that the feeling is mutual. We both live in Akron. We both worry about hate crimes, especially ones that hurt people who look like us and pray like us. And yet, I don't know what it feels like to be a black man in Akron at all. He doesn't know what it feels like to be a Jewish man in Akron. So how do we find a way to be connected to someone who lives right next to us, who we can see but who we don't recognize? And finally, as we look at this continuing war in Ukraine, and I know we all want to feel connected to those people who are halfway across the world, and who, even if we did see them, we more than likely wouldn't know who they are. It seems to me that much of what we're doing today is trying to figure out how to be close with people who are far from us, either in their life experience, their location, or both. A favorite story of mine from my former synagogue, which, like this synagogue, built a new building just a few years ago. And one of the lead gifts was from a family who had a love of art and who had more art than they knew what to do with. So they created a beautiful outdoor courtyard. It was a sculpture garden that you could see from almost anywhere in the building. And like moving into a new home, which I imagine many of us have done, it sometimes takes a while for things to get up on the wall and furniture to get in the right place, but the sculpture garden was there first. And so every day I would walk to my office and I would see this beautiful sculpture garden through the window. And on nice days, I'd walk outside and enjoy looking at the pieces of art, not knowing who the artists were or what their intended purpose was. And as you would walk down this pathway and get to the centerpiece, clearly where everything was leading you, there was this one 4x4 piece of metal sitting there, waiting for a sculpture to be placed on it. And I waited for months, and I walked by it for months, and eventually about a year goes by, and I went to the executive director, who was also the knower of everything. I said, when is that last sculpture going to get there? We've had everything put up on the walls, all the furniture's in place. We've been looking at every other sculpture the entire time since the day we moved into this building. Is it ever going to arrive? And he laughed at me. He said, Josh, the little black square that's 4 feet by 4 feet that's 2 inches off the ground, that's the sculpture. Nothing else is coming. The beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And so I went back out and for the first time looked at this piece of art as a piece of art. And I took our students out there because it quickly became a favorite. I would ask the students to stand around and ask them what the sculpture was. And they would laugh as if I was pulling their leg. There is no sculpture. For me, this was the best way to understand God from a Jewish perspective. Standing around this 4x4 square, the students looked at each other. And then I would read Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. God created humankind in the divine image. Creating it in the image of God, God created male and female. Since the beginning of our tradition, we've been challenged with trying to see what we cannot see, with trying to be close to something, to some being greater than ourselves that we couldn't imagine, that we didn't really know personally. And the Torah starts in the very first chapter by telling us to look at each other. For we will feel closer to what we cannot see and do not know if we find that what we are looking for is familiar. Last week, I mentioned that there were a few rabbis who I did not know personally, but who at least we could feel a relation to, who were stuck in Ukraine. This week, an article came out listing Jewish people we know, not personally, but we know who they are, but we may not have known they were from Ukraine. The list includes the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism, Golda Meir, the prime minister of Israel, who prior to being an American citizen was born in Kyiv. Actor Mila Kunis, am I pronouncing her name correctly? Mila, see? I knew somebody would know. Natan Sharansky, the face of the Refusnik movement, Chaim Nachman Bialik, one of the great Hebrew poets, along with great Zionists, Ahad Ha'am, Zev Jabotinsky, who have any number of streets named after them in Israel. All of these people whom we would say we are familiar with, that perhaps we would say we know because we've studied them, we've been impacted by them, we've watched them on TV, we've bragged about their accomplishments. They at one point were Ukrainians. The list is not important because it has Jewish names on it. It's important because when we want to be close to someone or something that we can't see, that's far from us, one of the best tools to get us there is to see our faces, familiar faces, in those that we don't recognize. It worked in the Bible, telling the people, look at each other. It worked with teenagers around a 4x4 sculpture that had no sculpture. And it works when we read an article or hear names of people who are facing war across the world, and we recognize those faces as people who have had an impact on our life. This week, as Huey will share tomorrow, we're reading all about the tabernacle. He's going to teach us all about it, so pay attention in the morning. It's the tent that the Israelites set up in the wilderness for God to dwell in. We're in the book of Exodus now. We're at the very end, in fact. In Genesis, God said, look at each other. But in Exodus, it changes. God said, if you want to see me, build something to put where I can't be seen. So if we want to know someone we've never seen, we look at other people. Perhaps if there's someone who we do know, but we can't reach them because they're too far away. By this point in the Bible, in Torah, the people know God. God helped them out of Egypt. God has been communicating through Abraham and then Moses. They know each other. They don't always like each other, but they know each other. God says, you know me now, but you can't see me, so build a structure so that you can be reminded of our relationship. Earlier this week, Ukrainian president called upon his Jewish background to try to bring us closer to his country, and he pulled upon this very theme. This year, just this last week, 2022, the Russian army bombed a radio tower. It just happens that the tower was on the same site as the Babi Yar massacre. In 1941, the Nazis killed 33,000 Jews in 2 days on that very site. At the time, they were fighting the Russians. The irony was not lost on President Zelensky. He said to the world, "What is the point of saying never again for 80 years if the world stays silent when a bomb drops on the same site of Babi Yar?" He called upon one of the great tools of our tradition. In that place, a place that is now a memorial, Zelensky knew we would remember. We know those people. Whether we were related to any of those 33,000 people or not, he knows that out there in the world, there is a community and many others who join with us who will refuse to forget the people we knew who we lost a century ago. And he knows that that space keeps their memory. The memory of those whom we knew in a memorial. But we can't see them any longer, but we know them. So he called upon that great power, saying, you can't let this sacred space be a place that is bombed again. So finally, what do we do when it's not someone who we knew and it's not someone far away? This week's portion is the last chapters of Exodus. Next week, we begin with the words of Leviticus. They begin with these words, Vayikra el Moshe, daber el bnei Yisrael. And God spoke to Moses, and Moses spoke to the Israelites. When we don't know someone and when we can't see them, but we want to find a way to connect with them, we close our eyes and perhaps just listen. Yesterday, a friend posted a video on Facebook. It was a picture of a group of families huddled in the basement of their apartment complex, clearly in the Ukraine. It's a picture that now I, along with you, have seen dozens of times. But when I clicked on the video, the sound was of the family singing Shalom Aleichem, which we sang just a few minutes ago, because they were having Shabbat in the basement of this apartment. I didn't need to see them. I didn't need to know how far away they were. I didn't need to know if I recognized them or didn't. All I had to do was hear what they were saying, and I knew that we had a connection. When we have no face to recall, no shared geography, listening to what other people's experiences are and finding the connection to our own, it makes the world incredibly small. It makes a basement in Ukraine feel like a sanctuary in Akron. And yet, for all of time, we might say we've struggled with how far we are from people, how easily distanced. But we have the tools to bridge those gaps. We've always had those tools. As we look across the world and across our city, I pray that we keep these tools, the ones given to us in our sacred text, close at hand. That we, as we move out of this, I won't say pandemic, chapter of this pandemic, that we remember how to use these tools more often, because some of the distance we've experienced has made them less frequent in our lives. Find ways to see each other more, hear each other more, to find how someone living in our city whose experience is different than ours can be shared. so that we can feel close to those we know well, who are distanced from us, so that we can understand the pain and suffering across a sea that we know is of our concern, so that we can find that there are bridges that we can build easily with tools we've always had. May we find our way across that bridge with no fear. May we find that it brings us closer to those who need our help and that they are close for us when we need theirs. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will, and may we make it our own. We'll do just that now as we listen to the names and the words that ask us to turn our thoughts and prayers towards those who are in need of healing. Page 253, the words